J.P. Me wore red to his wife's father's funeral, not dark red, not burgundy, blood red. The kind of red that announces itself before the man even enters the room. The kind of red that says, I am not here to grieve. I am here to win. He thought JoJo would crumble the moment she saw him walk through those cemetery gates. He thought 8 months pregnant, soaking in cold Los Angeles rain, standing over her father's casket with nowhere to go and no one left to run to, he thought that would be the perfect moment to end her. Publicly, permanently, cleanly. He was calculating a loss. He had no idea he was signing away $1 billion. Welcome, friends. Before we go any further, if you love a story where the woman outsmarts every room she walks into, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of this. And drop in the comments, where are you watching from? Are you Team JP Me deserved everything that came for him, or Team JoJo should have taken even more? We want to know. Now, let's get into this. The sky over Los Angeles had been threatening all morning. By the time the funeral began, it had made good on every promise. Rain came down in cold silver curtains across Hillcrest Memorial Cemetery, drumming against the white casket pooling in the dark hollows of the freshly turned earth. Lightning tore through the violet sky in the distance, jagged electric furious, as if even the heavens had an opinion about what was unfolding beneath them. JoJo stood at the front of the gathering in a loose black dress that fell softly over the full heavy curve of her belly. Her long box braids hung damp and dark against her brown skin, rain moving down her face in slow, quiet streams that mixed with the tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. One hand rested low on her stomach, instinctive, protective, the kind of touch that happens before a mother even thinks about it. Her other hand held a single white rose, the same kind that crowned her father's casket in a blanket of petals gone translucent in the rain. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Her eyes told that story without a single word, swollen, shadowed, heavy with a grief that had settled into her bones. But she stood straight. That was what people who knew JoJo always noticed first. She could be breaking apart on the inside and still hold herself like a woman who had never once folded. Her father had given her that. Stand up, baby girl. Even when the ground is shaking beneath you, stand up. The priest's voice rose and fell over the sound of the rain. Men and women in black surrounded her, her father's old colleagues, neighbors, musicians who had driven from 3 states away just to stand in this cemetery in the cold. They wept without shame. Her father had been the kind of man who made people feel like they mattered. He had lived quietly, moved gently through the world, and left invisible marks on every life he touched. JoJo felt the baby shift a slow rolling movement beneath her ribs like a quiet nudge from the inside. Not yet, little one. Stay with me a little longer. And then she heard it. Not thunder, not the soft murmur of mourners, something else entirely, the sound of expensive shoes on wet gravel, slow, deliberate. But each step placed with the kind of confidence that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. The hairs on the back of JoJo's neck rose before she even turned around. Something deep and wordless inside her, that instinct women carry in their chests, the one that has never once lied, told her to stay still. Told her that whatever was walking toward her through this cemetery was about to split her life cleanly in 2. Everything before this moment and everything after. She turned anyway. J.P. Me came through the cemetery gate like the storm had sent him personally. He was dressed in red, not a pocket square, not a flash of color at the collar, a full, perfectly tailored blood-red suit, sharp at every seam, fitted like armor, pressed without a single wrinkle despite the rain. His long black hair was pulled back slick and controlled not one strand out of place. The tattoos on the backs of his hands, dark old ink that marked his bloodline in a language most people in this country couldn't read, caught the light from a distant lightning strike as he walked. He was not walking like a man attending a funeral. He was walking like a man who had already decided how this meeting would end. The mourners noticed him before he reached the front. Conversation stopped mid-word. Eyes moved without meaning to. People shifted aside without fully understanding why, only that something in his stride told your body to move before your mind could give the instruction. J.P. Me had always had that effect. He entered spaces and the spaces rearranged themselves around him. He stopped 3 feet from JoJo. He looked at her. At her damp braids, at her red-rimmed eyes, at the full unmistakable curve of her belly. His face held no grief, no guilt, not even discomfort, only assessment. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a line item he's decided to cut from a budget. Jojo. Low, controlled, a voice that had never needed to raise itself because it had never in its life gone unheard. She held his gaze without flinching. JP. He reached inside his jacket, slowly, and he pulled out an envelope, brown, thick, sealed, stamped across the front in cold, blunt letters, divorce. The priest stopped speaking. The mourners went still. Even the rain seemed to hesitate just for a single breath, as if the sky itself needed a moment to register what it was witnessing. JP Me extended the envelope toward her. Right there, in front of her father's casket. One in front of every person who had loved her father, in front of the white roses and the raw earth and every promise he had ever made her. Sign it, he said quietly. And we're done. Jojo looked at the envelope. Then she looked at him. And something moved behind her eyes, something that was not tears, not rage, not fear. Something quiet, something settled, something that looked almost exactly like she had been expecting this. She reached out. She took the envelope. Then JP Me did the second thing, the thing that the 40 people standing in that cemetery would never forget. He raised his voice just enough to ensure every single mourner could hear him clearly over the rain. And for the record, he said, I'll be contesting the paternity of that child. Yeah, my lawyers will be in touch. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Jojo had ever heard. A woman behind her gasped. Someone else said his name under their breath like a curse. The musicians who had driven from 3 states to honor her father stood with their hands at their sides and their faces rigid with a disgust that needed no translation. Jojo did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked at JP Me for exactly 3 seconds with those dark, swollen eyes that had been awake for 72 hours, and she said one thing quietly and clearly enough for the same 40 people to hear. My father knew you were coming today. He left you a message. JP Me said nothing. He said a man who mistakes silence for weakness has already lost. She opened her clutch, slid the envelope inside, and turned back to her father's casket without another word. And somewhere across the city in a secure vault Jojo had visited 3 days before the funeral, a legal document was already waiting. One her father had written sealed and left specifically for this moment. JP Me thought he was ending her story. He had just started it. Across the cemetery, beneath the long, dripping arm of an oak tree, a silver-haired man in a gray coat stood watching. He hadn't moved during the entire exchange. He had simply observed the way a chess player observes a board cataloging positions, noting where each piece now stood. His name was Mr. O, and he was not simply a lawyer. It was 22 years ago, before the gray hair and the quiet office and the manila folders, he had been something else entirely. He had operated under 3 different names in 4 different countries, doing work that governments preferred to forget existed. He had dismantled operations not with weapons, but with information, the kind of information that arrives precisely when it is most devastating. He had walked away from that life the same way he did everything, without announcement. He had met Jojo's father 6 months later and recognized immediately a man who understood the same fundamental truth he did, that the most dangerous power is the kind nobody sees coming. He had spent 17 years helping Raymond James Parker build something no one would see coming. He took out a phone, typed 2 words. She's ready, but the response came in seconds. Then begin. By the time Jojo had whispered her final goodbye to her father's casket, her lips pressed briefly to the wet wood, her hand resting one last time on the white roses, 2 black sedans had pulled quietly to the service road behind the cemetery. Not Mafia vehicles, not local. These cars had federal plates, and the men inside them wore suits that cost more than careful thought and less than a conscience. Jojo walked toward them without looking back. Her housekeeper met her at the gate with an umbrella, a small overnight bag, a single folded document with a wax seal Jojo had never seen before, pressed with a mark that looked like an open compass over still water. Inside the first sedan, she opened the document. At the top, in her father's handwriting, the same careful looping script he had used to sign her birthday cards her entire life, were 3 words: trust the storm. And below that, a single number, 12 digits. Jojo stared at it until the number stopped being a number and started being something else, something vast and terrifying and quiet, the way power is always quiet when it belongs to someone who knows exactly what to do with it. Her baby kicked hard against her ribs. She pressed her hand to the spot. "I know," she whispered. "I know." What she didn't know not yet was that J.P. Mee's most trusted lieutenant had been sitting 3 rows behind her at the funeral, watching, reporting. And what he told J.P. Mee that night would send the most feared man in the Korean syndicate into a rage that would shake 3 cities. But that conversation hadn't happened yet. First, there was the office, the vault, the man with silver hair and a past he had buried in 4 countries. First, there was the truth. The building had no sign. That was the first thing Jojo noticed when the sedan pulled to the curb on a quiet street in downtown Los Angeles, a street lined with unmarked doors and frosted glass windows that offered nothing to the eye. No name, no logo, no number above the entrance. Just a heavy black door with a single brass handle worn smooth by decades of deliberate hands. Mr. O was already waiting inside. He looked different here than he had at the cemetery. There he had stood at the periphery, small, forgettable, the kind of man your eyes slide past without registering. Here inside this low-lit office of dark mahogany and older silence, he occupied space the way significant men do, without effort, without announcement. His silver hair was combed back from a face that had seen things it never intended to speak about. His gray coat was gone, replaced by a dark suit that fit him with the precision of something custom and old. He did not offer his hand when Jojo entered. He gestured instead to the chair across from him, leather deep brown, the kind of chair that had held the weight of difficult decisions for longer than either of them had been alive. Jojo sat. She set her bag beside her, smoothed her damp dress over her belly with one hand, and met his gaze without preamble. "Tell me everything," she said. Mr. O sat down. He opened a single manila folder on the desk between them and turned it to face her. Inside were documents, legal filings, property transfers, corporate registrations, all dated across a span of 3 decades, all connected by a single name, buried inside shell company after shell company, layered like Russian nesting dolls, each one hiding the one beneath it. The name at the center of all of it. Parker Holdings, LLC, her father's name, hidden in plain sight. "Your father was not a jazz musician who happened to own property," Mr. O said. His voice was low and even with the cadence of a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous information is delivered calmly. He was one of the most sophisticated private real estate strategists on the West Coast. He spent 30 years quietly purchasing the land beneath infrastructure that other people built on top of. Rail yards, storage facilities, cold chain distribution centers, a pause. Port terminals. The last 2 words landed in the room like stones dropped into deep water. Jojo was still. "Which port terminals?" she said. Mr. O turned the folder another degree toward her. She looked down at the list. Every single terminal J.P. Mee's syndicate used to move product through the port of Los Angeles was on that page. Every warehouse, every distribution point, every legitimate logistics company the Mee family had spent a decade using to build their operation into something that looked from the outside like respectable international commerce. All of it built on land that belonged to her father. Land that now belonged to her. "He never told you because he wanted you safe," Mr. O said quietly. "The moment J.P. Mee's family knew what your father held, you would have become a target. Everything he did, the modest apartment, the jazz gigs, the performance of an ordinary life, was a shield. For you." Jojo's jaw tightened. She could feel the grief trying to surface again, real and hot and enormous, and she pressed it down the way she had been pressing things down for 3 days. There would be time for grief. Not now. "The number," she said. "In the document he left me. 1,043,000,000 and some hundreds of thousands." Mr. O said it without inflection, the way one states a fact about weather. "That is the current assessed value of the combined holdings. It does not include the projected increase in port terminal valuations over the next 7 years, which our analysts estimate would push the total considerably further." "There's a condition," she said. "He told me, in the letter." Mr. O nodded. "The divorce clause. The inheritance only transfers fully into your name once your marriage to J.P. Mee is legally dissolved and finalized. Your father built that clause specifically because he anticipated this outcome." A beat. He knew Jojo. He had known for 2 years what kind of man J.P. Mee was becoming. He planned accordingly. Something moved through Jojo's chest, a wave of something so layered she couldn't have named it. Love and loss and fury and gratitude and the devastating tenderness of a father who had died protecting a daughter who hadn't even known she needed protecting. And J.P. Mee's lawyers, she said, the prenup. The corners of Mr. O's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, the expression of a man who had been waiting for precisely this question. Your husband is a meticulous man. He insisted on a prenup with an absolute separation clause. Whatever was hers before and during the marriage remains hers. Whatever enters her name as inheritance is categorically untouchable by the other party. He folded his hands on the desk. He signed that document himself 3 years ago. He was very proud of it. The silence that followed was almost musical. He locked himself out of $1 billion with his own pen, Jojo said slowly. With considerable satisfaction at the time, yes? And there it was. The first real breath Jojo had drawn in 3 days. Slow, deep. The kind of breath that comes when the ground beneath you stops shaking and you realize it was never going to swallow you. But then Mr. O opened a second folder, and his expression changed. There is one more thing, he said. Something your father did not put in the letter. Something I need to tell you before J.P. Mee's people figure out what has happened. He looked at her steadily. His mother knows. She has known from the beginning. Jojo went very still. She helped him build it, Mr. O continued. The matriarch of the Mee family helped your father hide the money. She is the reason the shell companies were structured the way they were. She has contacts your father never could have accessed alone. He paused. She wants to meet with you. Tonight. The rain outside had finally stopped. The silence it left behind felt enormous. What happened at that meeting, what the matriarch of the most feared Korean syndicate said to the woman her son had left in a cemetery, would not surface for days. But when it did, J.P. Mee would realize that the most devastating blow of his life had not come from an enemy. It had come from his own blood. J.P. Mee did not go home after the funeral. He went to the 54th floor of a glass tower in Century City, where a bottle of Japanese whiskey was already open, and his attorney, a thin, precise man named Yu, was waiting with a leather portfolio and the expression of someone who expected to deliver good news. It's clean, Yu said, before J.P. Mee had even removed his jacket. The filing is clean. Once she signs, the separation is airtight. There's nothing she can come back with. No shared assets of consequence, no joint business holdings, no. I know it's clean. J.P. Mee poured 2 fingers of whiskey and stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city, the sprawl of it, the lights just beginning to flicker on, as dusk settled like smoke over the basin. I wrote the terms myself. Of course. You set the portfolio down. I just want to confirm the medical debt acquisition is proceeding. The house will be vacated by tomorrow morning. J.P. Mee turned from the window. The city lights caught the planes of his face, the angular jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the dark eyes that gave nothing away for free. I want the keys in my hand by 9. You nodded, made a note. And the paternity challenge, J.P. Mee continued, his voice dropping half a register. I want it filed formally, not just narrative. I want actual legal proceedings initiated. I want her responding to paperwork while she's still in a hospital bed. You hesitated. Just briefly. That could create complications if it later becomes... It won't become anything. J.P. Mee's voice was flat, final. Handle it. He turned back to the window. He did not think about Jojo's face when she took the envelope. He had trained himself long ago to excise moments that didn't serve him. It was a skill he had developed at 17 in a basement in Seoul, the first time he had been asked to make a decision that cost someone else everything. He had discovered that the mind was a room, and you could decide with enough discipline which furniture stayed and which you put out for disposal. Jojo went out for disposal. And yet, the way she had looked at him, not with the devastation he had expected, not with the raw public grief he had choreographed this entire scene to produce. She had looked at him the way his grandfather used to look at men who underestimated him right before he took everything they had. J.P. Mee pressed 2 fingers against the cool glass. She has nothing, he told himself. Her father left her nothing. He had verified it, twice. His financial investigator, the best in the city, had gone 3 layers deep into her father's estate and found exactly what J.P. Mee had expected to find. Modest savings, a small life insurance policy already earmarked for funeral costs and debt. Comfortable, manageable debt, nothing extraordinary, but enough to justify the acquisition, enough to justify the timeline, enough to ensure she had no ground to stand on when the sun rose tomorrow. He was certain. But he was also wrong. Across the city in an office, Jojo was just leaving. Mr. O was already on the phone with a federal title attorney. The transfers were being processed in real time. Quiet, legal, unstoppable. Every port terminal, every warehouse parcel, every strip of land beneath every logistics facility the Me family had built their legitimacy on top of, transferring, quietly, into Jojo's name. By the time J.P. Me finished his second whiskey and told you to leave, the legal architecture of his entire empire had already shifted 1 degree beneath his feet. He didn't feel it yet. Earthquakes never announce themselves. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Jojo stood at the door of the house she had grown up in, the small craftsman on a tree-lined street in Limert Park, the house that smelled like cedar and old records and the particular warmth of a father who had loved her fiercely and quietly her entire life. She stood there in a camel coat over her black maternity dress, her braids pulled back from her face, her expression controlled and distant, watching J.P. Me's men load boxes onto a truck in the driveway. She had not packed her own things. She stood with a single item in her hands, a small wooden music box, hand-carved, the kind that plays when you open the lid. Her father had brought it back from Busan 20 years ago. She had never asked him why he'd gone to Busan. She had a feeling she was beginning to understand. One of J.P. Me's men, broad-shouldered with the careful blankness of someone paid to intimidate, stopped in front of her. "Ma'am, you'll need to clear out any personal items before I have what I need," she said quietly. He hesitated. Something in her voice, the complete absence of distress, the stillness, made his instructions feel suddenly inadequate. He stepped aside. J.P. Me had sent someone else as well. A woman arrived at 11, tall, polished in a cream blazer and heels that managed the uneven walkway without effort. She had the kind of beauty that had been carefully constructed and rigorously maintained, and she surveyed the house with proprietary eyes as she came up the path. Sue. J.P. Me's mistress for the better part of 2 years. He had sent her to oversee the inventory. A final cruelty. The particular pleasure of a man who liked his victories witnessed by the people who benefited from them. Sua stopped in front of Jojo, looked her up and down, at the belly, at the music box, at the quiet, devastating composure on Jojo's face. "You should really have seen this coming," Sua said. Her English was lightly accented and extremely deliberate. "A man like J.P. Me doesn't stay with—" "Sign this," Jojo said. She held out a single sheet of paper. Sua blinked, looked at it. "What is this?" "Asset transfer witness form. Standard legal document." Jojo's voice was pleasant, neutral. "One of J.P. Me's men is supposed to sign it as the authorized representative on site, but since you're clearly in charge here—" A pause, measured. "Unless you're not." Sua's eyes narrowed. She took the document, read the top line. "Like transfer confirmation for personal property items categorized under the Parker estate," and signed it without reading further. Because Sua was a woman who knew better than to appear uninformed. She handed it back. Jojo folded it carefully and slid it into her coat pocket. Sua had just legally witnessed the transfer of 17 parking and land use easements beneath J.P. Me's Century City Holdings into the Parker Foundation Trust. She had signed her name under the words "Authorized Representative of J.P. Me" without once reading past the first line. She would not discover what she had done for 11 days. When she did, she called J.P. Me in a panic. At 2 a.m, her voice stripped of every carefully maintained layer of composure, and he listened to her explain what had happened, and he said nothing for a very long time. Because there was nothing to say. The woman he had sent to humiliate his pregnant wife at her childhood home had handed that same woman the pen that sealed the most significant property transfer of the year. He had chosen Sua for her cruelty. Jojo had used her vanity. He hung up without responding. Sua never heard from him again. Jojo picked up the music box and walked to the waiting car without looking back. She did not look back at the house. She did not look back at Sua. She had learned, was still learning, the discipline her father had practiced for 30 years, the absolute stillness of a person who knows where the river is going and does not need to rush it. What J.P. Me still didn't know would not stay hidden much longer. But first, there was the matriarch. Then, and nothing that had come before, had prepared Jojo for what that woman was about to say. The Me estate sat at the end of a private road in Bel Air behind iron gates that opened without sound and closed the same way. Efficient, automatic, the kind of security infrastructure that had never needed to announce itself because it had never once failed. Jojo had been inside these gates 4 times in 3 years of marriage. Each time had felt like entering a different country, one with its own laws, its own silence, its own particular quality of air, as if wealth at this altitude filtered out something ordinary people breathe without noticing. The car stopped at the side entrance, not the main door. The side. She noted it, filed it. A housekeeper led her through corridors of dark stone and low lamplight, past walls hung with scrollwork and old silk panels, into a room at the back of the house that Jojo had never been permitted to enter during her marriage. It was smaller than she expected. A sitting room, intimate, low-ceilinged, heated by a fireplace that had been burning long enough to warm the stone around it to amber. 2 chairs faced each other across a low table set with tea. One chair was already occupied. Madame Mie was 71 years old and looked exactly that. Not older, not younger, but precisely deliberately 71, as if she had decided long ago that age was information she had no interest in disguising. Her silver hair was pinned back with 2 lacquered sticks. Her handbag was deep navy embroidered at the collar in thread, so fine it looked like writing. Her hands folded in her lap were the hands of a woman who had made decisions that cost her sleep and made them anyway. She did not rise when Jojo entered, but her eyes, sharp and black and extraordinary, tracked her across the room with an attention that felt almost physical. Jojo sat down. Neither woman spoke for a moment. The fire moved. "You look like your father," the matriarch said. Her English was formal and without warmth, not cold precisely, but true the way a blade is true, without decoration. Around the eyes, he had eyes that held more than he said. Jojo's hands resting on her belly pressed slightly. "You knew him. For 26 years. She reached for the tea and poured with a steadiness that belonged to another age. "Before you were born. Before he was what he became. Before I understood what I was looking at." She set the cup in front of Jojo. "Drink." Jojo did not drink. "The shell companies," she said. "Mr. O told me you helped structure them." "Yes." "Why?" The matriarch looked into her own cup for a moment. When she looked up, something in her expression had shifted, something that on another woman's face Jojo might have called grief. "Because my son was 8 years old once, and I knew who he would become before he did, and I spent 20 years trying to prevent it and failed." A pause, precise as punctuation. "Your father understood power, real power, not violence, not territory, not fear. The other kind, the kind that survives when everything else is burned. I helped him build what he built because I wanted when the time came for someone to be left standing who was worthy of it." The fire snapped. Jojo was very still. "You chose me. Your father chose you." I agreed with him. The matriarch's gaze moved to Jojo's belly and then back to her face, and there was something in it old and vast and almost tender that Jojo felt in the back of her throat. "I have a son who wears red to funerals, and I have a grandson who will be born into a world that needs to be different than the one his father built." She set down her cup. "Whatever you need, whatever resources, whatever access, whatever knowledge I possess about the Mie family's operations, it is yours. On one condition." Jojo waited. "My grandson does not grow up knowing his father as an enemy. He grows up knowing him as a lesson." A pause. "But there is a difference, and it matters." Jojo held the weight of that for a long moment, the heat of the fire, the smell of the tea going cool between them, the sound of her own pulse steady despite everything. "You're betraying your own son. I am protecting my bloodline." The matriarch's voice did not waver. "My son stopped being mine the night he chose territory over humanity. What remains of him is not something I am capable of protecting. But you..." She looked at Jojo with those dark, unreadable eyes. "You are exactly what this family needed and never deserved." Jojo looked down at her hands. She thought about her father, about the music box, about 30 years of invisible architecture built quietly beneath the feet of people who never thought to look down. She thought about the way he had always said, "The best moves, baby girl, are the ones that happen before anyone thinks the game has started." She picked up the tea, drank. It was bitter, expensive, exactly right. "Tell me about the operations," she said. "Every terminal, every route, every favor J.P. Mie has called in, and every debt he still owes." Her voice was calm, absolute. "I want to understand his empire the way he understands it, from the inside." The matriarch studied her for one final moment, the way you look at something when you want to remember it exactly as it is. Then she nodded and began. Outside the estate on the private road, a black car had been parked for the past 40 minutes with its engine off. Inside it, one of J.P. Mee's lieutenants sat with a long-range audio device pointed at the side of the house and a phone in his lap. He had already sent one message. As he was composing a second, he had not heard everything. But he had heard enough, and what he was about to tell J.P. Mee would shatter the one illusion the man had carried into his 54th floor office and his careful whiskey and his absolute certainty that he had already won. J.P. Mee had built an empire, and the two women inside that house were in the process of deciding very quietly which parts of it to keep. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Jojo was still awake when it happened, sitting in the back bedroom of a suite Mr. O had arranged at a private residence in Los Feliz, the music box open on the nightstand beside her, its small melody turning over and over in the dark like a heartbeat that refused to stop. As she had been reading through the port terminal documents for the third time, cross-referencing dates tracing the invisible architecture her father had spent 3 decades building one quiet transaction at a time. She felt it before she understood it. A tightening, low and deep and unmistakable. She set the documents down very carefully, the way you set something down when your body has just announced that it is no longer taking instructions from your mind. By the time Mr. O's driver reached Cedars Sinai, Jojo's braids were loose around her shoulders, and her camel coat was the only thing between her and the cold night air. She walked through the entrance with one hand pressed to her side, and her jaw set with the particular discipline of a woman who had decided somewhere in the last 72 hours that she would not be seen falling apart again. Not here. Not by anyone. The private wing was already arranged. Mr. O had seen to that weeks ago another of her father's preparations, another move made in advance of a board the other player hadn't known was set. She was in a room within 8 minutes, monitors, quiet lighting, the low, steady sound of a machine confirming what she already knew. Her son was coming, and he was coming early, and the world he was arriving into was in the middle of being completely reorganized on his behalf. She almost laughed at that. The doctor, a soft-spoken woman with careful hands, told her they would try to slow things down. That it was manageable. That early did not mean dangerous. Jojo nodded and breathed and kept her eyes on the ceiling and thought about her father's handwriting on that document. Trust the storm. She was still trusting it when J.P. Mee arrived. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the corridor low and controlled, using the particular register he reserved for people he expected to move for him. She heard the nurse's voice respond, polite and firm. Then silence. Then his voice again, harder this time, stripped of its veneer. The door did not open. The guards Mr. O had positioned outside it did not move. These were not ordinary security. Mr. O had spent 22 years knowing exactly which people to call when a door needed to stay closed against a man who believed no door applied to him. The two men standing outside Jojo's room had each operated in environments where J.P. Mee's kind of intimidation was considered entry-level. They stood with their hands folded and their faces empty, and J.P. Mee's voice did not move them by a single degree. J.P. Mee stood in that corridor for 4 minutes. Jojo knew because she counted. She lay in that bed with monitors tracing the steady pulse of her son's heartbeat, and she counted every second of the 4 minutes it took for the most feared man in the Korean syndicate to understand that he could not get through a door. When the door finally opened, it was not J.P. Mee who entered. It was you, his attorney, carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression that had been carefully constructed to suggest regret while communicating strategy. Yet he set the envelope on the tray beside her bed without touching her, without meeting her eyes for more than a second. "Mr. Mee is requesting a competency evaluation," Yu said quietly. "Given the circumstances, the stress, the premature labor, he believes it may be in everyone's interest to establish a temporary guardianship over any major financial decisions until—" "Mr. Yu." Jojo's voice was so even, it stopped him mid-sentence. She turned her head and looked at him with dark, exhausted, absolutely lucid eyes. "Open the top drawer of the cabinet behind you." He hesitated, opened it. Inside was a single document, cream paper, heavy stock, already signed, already notarized, already filed with the county recorder's office at 9 o'clock the previous morning. 12 hours before she had gone into early labor. "Dus a power of attorney, transferring all financial decision-making authority to the Parker Foundation Trust for the duration of any medical incapacitation." Yu read it. His face did a thing that faces do when the argument they came in with has just become irrelevant. The trust's legal team has already been notified of tonight's situation, Jojo said. They were notified before I left the residence. Everything is managed, everything is protected, and my son, she paused, one breath controlled, is not J.P. Mee's legal concern. The paternity challenge he filed this week will be answered. We have already submitted for court-ordered testing. The results will be entered into the public record. Every person who was standing in that cemetery when he made that accusation will have access to those results. Yu closed his eyes briefly. And when those results come back, Jojo continued, her voice still completely even, J.P. Mee will have publicly questioned the paternity of his own biological child in front of 40 witnesses at his father-in-law's funeral. That is the record he will carry, not me, him. Yu picked up his envelope. He left without another word. Jojo turned her face back to the ceiling. The monitor beeped. Her son's heartbeat moved through the room like a small, insistent drum line. Steady, certain, already fighting. Outside in the corridor, she heard J.P. Mee's voice one more time. Lower now. The register had changed, no longer commanding, not quite yet desperate, something in between that she had never heard from him before. Something that sounded underneath all the architecture of control like a man who had just encountered a wall he hadn't known was there. She closed her eyes. She thought about the music box, about the ports, about the matriarch's voice in that firelit room, and everything she had said in the hours that followed. The layers of information unfolded with the patience of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to give them away. She thought about what she now knew that J.P. Mee didn't. And somewhere, beneath the exhaustion and the physical pain and the grief that still lived in the bottom of her chest, like water in a basement, that hasn't fully drained somewhere beneath all of it, something that felt almost like anticipation began to rise. Her son arrived at 6:14 in the morning, small, fierce, loud with the outrage of new existence. The nurse placed him against Jojo's chest, and he quieted immediately as if he recognized her heartbeat, as if he'd been listening to it all along and had simply been waiting to confirm it from the outside. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. His skin was impossibly warm. "Hey," she whispered, "I've been expecting you." What J.P. Mee was doing at 6:14 in the morning 3 floors below and completely unable to reach either of them was something that not one person in his organization had ever seen before. He was sitting in a plastic chair, in a waiting room, like an ordinary man, and he had no idea that in 4 hours a vault across the city was going to open and everything he thought he owned was going to be handed to the woman upstairs. The vault was not what people imagined when they thought of $1 billion. There were no gold bars, no stacks of bound currency arranged for effect. It was a room windowless, climate-controlled, lit by recessed lighting that gave everything inside it the quality of a museum after closing. Mahogany table, 8 chairs, a single projector screen at the far end. The kind of room designed to contain significant information rather than significant wealth because the people who built it understood that those were different things. Jojo arrived at 10 in the morning. She had slept for 3 hours in the hospital, her son in a bassinet beside her bed, and changed into what Mr. O's assistant had brought to her room, a deep burgundy wrap dress that moved with her dark ankle boots, her braids gathered and pinned with 2 gold clips. She wore no jewelry except for a single thin chain at her throat, her father's, the one he had worn every day of her childhood. She had taken it from his bedside the morning after he died and hadn't removed it since. She looked walking into that vault like a woman who understood the weight of what she was about to inherit and had decided it would not bend her. Mr. O was already seated. Beside him, 2 federal title attorneys. On the opposite side of the table, 3 representatives from J.P. Mee's legal team, Yu, among them looking like a man who had spent the previous night revising his entire assessment of the situation. J.P. Mee himself was not supposed to be there. He came anyway. He arrived 11 minutes after Jojo, filling the doorway of the vault in a charcoal suit. No red today, she noted. He had made a calculation. He'd chosen the color of boardrooms of legitimacy of men who expected to be taken seriously. His long black hair was pulled back precisely. His face was composed. He looked at Jojo across the table with the contained intensity of a man who had spent the drive over rehearsing this moment and arrived to find the room had already moved on without him. She looked back at him with the calm of someone who had already lived it. He sat down. Mr. O opened the folder without preamble. "The estate of Raymond James Parker," he said. filed with the Los Angeles Superior Court, certified by the Federal Notarial Commission, and registered with the Port Authority Oversight Board of the State of California. He looked up once at Jojo, not at J.P. Me. Sole beneficiary, Josephine Renee Parker Me, known as Jojo. The terms are as follows. J.P. Me's lawyers had their pens ready. What happened next took 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, Mr. O read aloud the full scope of the Parker estate, the shell companies, the land holdings, the port terminal, deeds, the logistics easements, the warehouse parcels, the projected income streams, the existing lease agreements. He read the names of the companies whose foundations sat on Parker-owned land. He read the dollar figures. He read the terms of the divorce clause, which had activated the moment the court received the signed papers 2 days prior. He read the total. $1,043,217,000. And then he read something that was not in the original document summary Jojo had received, something her father had added in a codicil, filed separately discovered by Mr. O only the day before, a final clause. To my daughter, Mr. O read, and his voice that low, precise instrument that had delivered information without inflection for the entirety of this meeting shifted by half a degree into something almost human. The full inheritance is granted on the condition that the beneficiary assumes the role of principal owner across all Parker Holdings entities. This is not a passive inheritance. This is a transfer of responsibility. Take care of what I built the way I took care of you, quietly, completely, and without apology. The room was silent. Jojo's hand had moved without her deciding to move it to her father's chain at her throat. J.P. Me's pen had stopped. He was looking at the projector screen where the asset list had populated. To every terminal, every warehouse, every strip of land beneath every operation he had spent 15 years building. And his face was doing the thing faces do when a structure a person has trusted completely reveals itself as hollow. The color had left it. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, quietly, as if his blood had simply decided to redistribute itself somewhere more useful. His lead attorney leaned toward him and said something very low. J.P. Me did not respond. He was looking at Jojo. She was looking at the document in front of her. She picked up the pen Mr. O slid across the table. She signed her name, Josephine Renee Parker, in the same steady hand she had used to sign her father's birthday card since she was 7 years old. J.P. Me's chair scraped back. He stood. And for one moment, one unguarded, unscripted moment, the composure failed, not into rage, into something rawer than that, something that crossed his face so fast that only someone who had spent 3 years learning his expressions would have caught it. Jojo caught it. She held his gaze steadily across the table. No satisfaction in her face, no triumph, just the clear, level regard of a woman who has been underestimated for the last time and is no longer interested in explaining herself to the person who did it. Mr. O stood. He looked at J.P. Me and said quietly and without theater, "The Parker Foundation has engaged federal counsel regarding the lease terms for all existing occupants of Parker-owned infrastructure. Your legal team will receive the first communication by end of business today." A pause that carried the full weight of 22 years of knowing exactly how to end a room. "Mr. Me, you're in a queen's house now." J.P. Me walked out of the vault. His lawyers followed. And what happened in the elevator going down what J.P. Me said to you in those 40 seconds of dissent was the beginning of a decision that he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had not made. But Jojo didn't know that yet. She was still sitting at the table, both hands flat on the document she had just signed, breathing the recycled air of a windowless room that now held the legal record of everything her father had ever done for her. Mr. O placed a hand briefly on the back of her chair. Not on her shoulder, just the chair. It was enough. J.P. Me made his first mistake within 24 hours of the will reading. He called a meeting, not with his lawyers, but with his lieutenants. The men who ran his territory managed his routes, enforced his agreements. He summoned them to the Century City Tower and told them in the controlled declarative language he had always used with men who responded to certainty that the situation with his ex-wife was a temporary administrative problem that would be resolved through legal channels. Nobody in that room believed him. They had not believed him since the previous afternoon when the first of the lease notifications had arrived. Crisp federal letterhead, Parker Foundation logo in the upper corner. Routing numbers for new rent payments on infrastructure the Me Syndicate had been using until 48 hours ago as if they owned it. Which it turned out they never had. The word moved through his organization faster than J.P. Me could contain it. Jojo was not a rumor anymore. She was a landlord. Jojo herself was in a different building across the city, in a sunlit conference room on the 11th floor of a steel and glass tower in Culver City that the Parker Foundation now used as its operational headquarters. She sat at one end of the table in a fitted charcoal blazer and wide-leg trousers, her son asleep in a bassinet to her left, attended by a nurse. Her braids swept back from her face. She looked like someone who had always run a boardroom and was simply choosing today to let it show. Across the table sat 6 people. The Port Authority, liaisons, logistics attorneys, 2 forensic accountants who had spent the last 72 hours mapping the full scope of the Me Syndicate's use of Parker-owned infrastructure. The picture they had assembled was extensive. J.P. Me had 17 active revenue streams that touched Parker-owned land in some direct or indirect capacity. Some were obvious: the terminal leases, the warehouse operations. Others were more elegant: front companies nested inside front companies, each one dependent on access to port facilities that her father had quietly held the deeds on for decades. One by one, Jojo had them walk her through each stream. One by one, she initiated the process of calling them in. She did not move fast. That was what nobody who had ever underestimated her understood about the way she operated. She had learned at her father's knee that velocity was for people who were afraid. Real power moved at the speed of intention. Every notification the Parker Foundation sent was legal, documented, airtight. Every action reviewed by 3 attorneys before it left the building. She was not dismantling J.P. Me's empire. She was converting it, absorbing it, turning every dollar of criminal infrastructure into something that could survive daylight. Mr. O sat beside her throughout. He did not speak often, but every time the room paused at a decision point, every time an attorney looked uncertain, every time a number seemed too large or a move seemed too aggressive, she would glance at him and he would give her a look that said simply, "Proceed." The look of a man who had watched this board being set for 26 years and had complete confidence in where the pieces were going. What neither of them had anticipated was what J.P. Me did next. He contacted Sua again, not to comfort her about the document she had unknowingly signed. He had no interest in her panic. He contacted her as an operative one final time and gave her a task. Get inside the Parker Foundation's legal team. Find the gap. Find the clause that could be challenged or the filing that could be contested. What J.P. Me did not know was that Mr. O had anticipated this too. The person Sua approached, a junior associate at the Foundation's law firm, young enough to seem approachable, new enough to seem uncertain, was not uncertain at all. He had been briefed by Mr. O personally. He took the meeting. He listened. He accepted the number Sua offered, and he reported everything within the hour. When Sua realized she had walked into a setup, she sent J.P. Me a message telling him exactly what had happened. He did not respond. He was done with tools that had stopped being useful. Sua had served her purpose twice, both times for Jojo. She never heard from him again. Jojo received the transcript that evening. She read it at her new kitchen table, a rented house in Silver Lake, modest and clean, nothing decorative except the music box on the windowsill and a framed photograph of her father taken sometime in the late 90s, younger than she had ever known him, laughing at something off camera. She read the transcript twice, then she called Mr. O. "He's scared," she said. "He's cornered," Mr. O replied. "Those are different things. A scared man withdraws. A cornered man moves sideways. What's his next sideways move? A pause on the line, longer than usual. His syndicate partners in Seoul have been monitoring the situation. If they decide J.P. Me is too compromised, if they determine he cannot protect their interests or their access to the West Coast routes, they will cut him. Formally. Which means everything he holds in their name reverts to the partnership structure." Jojo turned this over. "And the partnership structure is legally registered on land your father owned." The silence that followed was almost comfortable. She had grown accustomed in the past week to the feeling of the ground being solid beneath her, the unfamiliar, extraordinary sensation of standing in a position that had been prepared for her before she even knew she needed it. "Please let them cut him," she said. "That is my recommendation as well." She hung up, looked at the photograph of her father, that off-camera laugh, wide and unguarded, the laugh of a man who found the world genuinely funny sometimes, despite everything he knew about it. She had not cried in 3 days. She let herself cry now, not long, Not dramatically, just the kind of crying that is actually gratitude wearing the only coat it has. She pressed 2 fingers to the photograph and said nothing because the things she needed to say to him did not have words yet, and she suspected they never would. Her son made a small sound from the next room. She wiped her face, stood. What was coming next she had prepared for. What she had not prepared for was the knock on her door at 10:45 that night. The figure standing in the rain on her front step. The last person she had expected to see. The person whose presence changed everything she thought she understood about why any of this had happened in the first place. The figure standing at her door was J.P. Me. Not in charcoal, not in red. In a plain dark jacket, hair loose around his shoulders, the city rain moving down his face in a way he had made no effort to shield against. He looked like a man who had driven a long way without deciding where he was going until he arrived. Jojo stood in the doorway and looked at him. She did not open the door further, did not step back to create the implication of an invitation. She simply stood there in her oversized gray sweater and loose braids and bare feet on the threshold of a house he had never been to, holding the door with one hand, and regarding him with the particular stillness she had developed over the past 6 months. The stillness of a woman who no longer needed to perform anything for anyone. "You should have called," she said. "You wouldn't have answered." That was true. She said nothing. He looked at her then. And for the first time since the cemetery, he dropped the architecture entirely. No calculation, no strategy, no careful deployment of whatever quality of his personality had always made rooms move for him. He looked at her the way men look when everything they built has come down and they are standing in the rubble trying to remember who they were before they started building. "Tia, I need you to hear something," he said. "JP?" The paternity challenge. His jaw tightened. The rain came down between them. "I'm withdrawing it. I filed the withdrawal this morning. Whatever I thought I was doing, it was wrong. He is my son. I knew it when I said it, and I said it anyway, and I am." He stopped. His voice had reached the edge of something. He pulled it back. "I'm withdrawing it." Jojo studied his face for a long moment, the angular jaw, the dark eyes that for once were not giving her the flat controlled nothing she had learned to read as danger. What she saw now was worse in a different way. It was a man arriving too late to a place that mattered. "I know you withdrew it," she said quietly. "Mr. O told me this afternoon." J.P. Me looked at her. "The public record will still show he was born and DNA confirmed. Every person at that funeral will know." She held his gaze without cruelty and without comfort. "You don't get to erase what you said, JP. You only get to decide what you do next." The rain fell. He stood in it. "Soul's cutting me," he said. "I know. The partnership assets are on Parker land, yes." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the sound of the rain filled everything between them. "Is there anything left?" he said finally. Not a request, not quite a question. The sound of a man testing ground he no longer trusted. "Left of what, JP?" He didn't answer. Behind her from the direction of the back bedroom came the soft sound of an infant waking. Brief, then settling again. She watched his face when he heard it. Something moved there that he couldn't contain, fast and layered and gone almost before it arrived. She had expected when this moment came to feel the clean satisfaction of a conclusion. She had not expected this. The specific quiet pain of standing in front of someone who could have been different and chose not to be, and understanding that grief and victory are not always separate things. "He's healthy," she said, because she was still that kind of person. J.P. Me closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Jojo." "No," gentle, absolute. "Whatever you came here to say, no, not because I'm angry. I'm past angry, because it's too late for this." She gestured slightly between them at whatever ghost of a thing he had driven through the rain hoping to find. "That's gone. I signed it away on my father's casket with full knowledge and no regret. The only decision in my marriage I made completely free." A pause. "It was the best one I ever made." He said nothing. She had expected argument, resistance, some last deployment of the man who had walked into a cemetery in a red suit and rearranged 40 people without raising his voice. But that man had been standing on land that didn't belong to him, and now he knew it. "Your mother is well," Jojo said. "She comes on Sundays. She holds him and cries a little and makes tea and acts like she didn't. He likes her." She paused. "I'll never keep her from him, or you if you earn it, but I need you to understand those are entirely separate things." J.P. Me nodded. slow, the nod of a man recalibrating his understanding of what he was allowed to want. "There's a position," she said, Port Operations Director for the Parker Foundation's West Coast Holdings. "The person we hire needs to understand the routes, the logistics, the informal networks that make the infrastructure actually function." She held his gaze steadily. "It pays well. It is entirely legal. It requires accountability to a board that I chair." The rain fell between them. He understood what she was offering. Not forgiveness. Something harder and more honest than forgiveness. A door, a narrow one. That required him to show up every single day to a life he had burned down and be accountable for what rose from the ash. Under her authority. On her terms. With no guarantee that showing up would ever be enough, but with the possibility that it might eventually mean something to the boy, asleep in the back bedroom of a house on a street he had never been to. "And if I say no?" he asked. "Then you say no," she said simply. "I run the ports either way." She stepped back from the door. Not to invite him in, to close it. She stood in the hallway of her quiet house and listened to the rain continue without him. Then she walked to the back bedroom and lifted her son from the bassinet, warm and solid and entirely unbothered by the weight of the world arranged around him, and carried him to the window that faced the direction of the harbor. The lights of the port were visible on clear nights from this room. Her father had known that when he chose this house. She understood now that everything he had ever chosen had been chosen with her in mind. The quiet life, the hidden architecture, the 30 years of invisible patience. All of it had been a father speaking in the only language he fully trusted. "I see what you are. I am making sure the world is ready for you." She held her son against her chest. His breath was even and warm against her collarbone. "The storm is over, Daddy," she said softly to the window, to the port lights, to the man who was no longer alive but whose work was everywhere she looked. "We won." Behind her on the nightstand, the music box played its small and faithful melody in the dark. The world outside kept moving. The ports, the routes, the legal machinery of an empire being slowly, completely, irrevocably converted into something extraordinary. Something that could survive daylight. Something built not on fear, but on 30 years of a quiet man's love for his daughter. And at the center of all of it, Josephine Renee Parker stood at a window with her son in her arms in the quiet, devastating knowledge that she had never needed to be rescued. She had only needed time. Her father had bought her that too. Friends, if this story moved you from that very first line to this final moment, then you already know this channel's home. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next story is coming, and you do not want the algorithm keeping it from you. Drop your city in the comments tonight. Lagos, Houston, London, Toronto, Accra, Birmingham, Atlanta, wherever you are watching from. Let us know. And we have to ask, are you Team JoJo took everything she deserved, or do you believe JP Me standing in that rain was the beginning of something real? Every comment gets read. Every opinion matters. We will see you in the next one.